It is a well-established causation between migration and the climate change. Of course, climate change involves not only what we think of in terms of CO2 in the atmosphere, it also goes down to droughts, flooding, pollution, and erosion. And throughout the history, this has been one driver for the migrations of people. In 2010, the UN climate panel, the IPCC, estimated that there were some 50 million climate migrants in the world, and warning that unless steps were taken, this number would rise to 150 million by 2050. Today, we are faced with a question that I think baffles some in the audience at least, and that is why climate migrants are not recognized as refugees, and why the global frameworks have not been updated and adjusted to this new reality. This panel will also discuss what can be done to help this situation. And it is in the context of the forest fires in Australia where in the international media it's been widely reported that Australia itself is running the danger of becoming an area prone to climate migration. With me here to discuss the scorched earth, communities, conflicts, and migrations are Kancham Gupta, who is from the Observer Research Foundation here in India, Iztok Mirošič, Special Envoy from the Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Renata Dessallien, who is the UN Coordinator here in India, and Christine Cipolla, who is the Regional Director for the Asia and Pacific for the International Red Cross, and Madina Megale Colomba, who is representing the Economic Policy Research Institute of Uganda. And I would like to start asking the panelists a question each, and we will hopefully take it from there, while hopefully the rest of you will be enjoying your dinner. And I was hoping to start with you, Renata. Can you talk a little bit about the human face of climate migration? Because I think it is important that we start on the human level before we move up into the higher spheres of international politics and international treaties.
Thanks very much, and very happy to be part of this important panel. And I think you picked a very good question to start with, because fundamentally we're talking about human lives. And we have to remember that the bulk of climate migrants are from the lower part of the economic pyramid. Climate change, of course, affects everybody. It affects everybody of every income level. But those who are most affected, and those who unfortunately end up as climate migrants, are those at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And from the UN's perspective, we are concerned about, of course, any migrant's well-being, but from a climate migrant perspective, we're concerned about who they are. And in most cases, these people are not only poor, but they're extremely vulnerable. We're talking about people with low income levels, with high levels of vulnerability. They may be women, children, people from ethnic minority groups, etc. And they find themselves dispossessed. And in concrete terms, what does this mean? It means basically they may lose members of their family, they may lose their homes, they lose their land, their assets, they lose their ability to even educate their children sometimes. So the human face, I think, is a very sad face. And for this reason, I think that when we deal with the subject, we have to keep this always in mind, that we're dealing with a human problem, people's human basic needs, but not only their basic development needs. I'm also referring to their issues of protection, because when people move, particularly across borders, but even within their own country, they're exposed to all sorts of particular risks, such as trafficking, such as violence, and therefore the life of a climate migrant is a pretty bleak life. From the UN's perspective, our primary concern, of course, is their well-being, and that's why I think that it's extremely important that we stress the human rights dimension of climate migrants, because fundamentally, through no actions from their own side, they find themselves victims of these extreme weather situations and climate events that force them to leave. It's not their choice to leave. It's a coping strategy. They're actually faced with staying behind and risking often their lives and livelihoods, or having to move. So the human face of climate migrants is a bleak one, and it's one that I think we have to keep in our mind as the international community try to come together around finding solutions for them, putting their human rights and their well-being foremost.
Thank you so much. And this sort of brings me into the question that I had prepared for you, Kanchan Gupta. Prior to the panel, we were talking about the question that climate change is rarely the sole cause of migration. And we were discussing briefly about trafficking, but also about the Rohingya situation. Would you care to comment a little bit about this? It's not a monocausal phenomenon, right?
No, it isn't. I mean, if you look at migration, which has happened in the course of the last 5-6 years, you will see that a lot of it was organized human trafficking, where you had traffickers who were running a racket and landing migrants in Europe. Now, there is evidence, and I really wouldn't want to go too deep into it, but the point which I have often tried to make is that the kind of concern which is expressed, the kind of funds which are committed, if that money were to go into mitigating climate change in vulnerable countries, in countries where it is most felt, where the people are most impacted, maybe that would bring about some sort of a long-term solution. The reason I mentioned Rohingyas to you is that the Rohingya influx into Bangladesh was not because of climate. The reasons were entirely different. But now we have a situation where Bangladesh is burdened, literally, and I use the word burdened with a purpose, that it is burdened with a large number of migrants and who refuse to go back. And Bangladesh itself faces climate change risks. I mean, their estuaries are in trouble, their coastline is in trouble. This year alone, the previous year alone, they faced repeated cyclones. So how do you deal with a problem that is exacerbated by climate? And the third point which I wanted to make is that there is migration happening within countries too. For instance, in a large country like India, you would have migration happening from one part of the country to another due to climate change reasons. And climate change is not only about flooding or drought, it's also about water. You have decreasing availability of water, which is forcing migration. So you have to look at it in totality, and instead of just looking at one aspect of human rights or the rights of migrants, I think the world should come together to think of ways and means of halting this migration, and that would essentially be about addressing climate challenges.
Thank you so much. But I guess the one question we probably should get to around about now is, Keston Chipola, Why are we talking about climate migrants and not climate refugees? What is the reason, in your opinion, why it has been so difficult to afford these people, these desperate people, refugee status?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight, and I would like to thank the ORF for this partnership that has been established between them and the International Committee of the Red Cross. We are very proud of it, and it has been extremely fruitful so far. I look at it through a very specific angle, through the angle of the potential overlapping between the conflict or conflict situation and a non-conflict situation and the climate. The ICRC has been working in Africa, all over the world, in 80 countries, 80 delegations around the world, amongst which 20, just as an example, 40% of our operations are in Africa, amongst which 20 countries are vulnerable to both climate change and armed conflict. Amongst those 20 countries, 16 are in Africa, where you have ongoing at the same time, as a double layer, if you want, the conflict, ongoing situation of war, and the climate change. And here we talk about Somalia, we talk about Central African Republic, we talk about Democratic Republic of the Congo, we talk about the South Sudan. All those countries have been there with a protracted situation conflict and a climate vulnerability. So far, and I'm joining a bit what Professor Gupta was saying, there is no direct correlation between a conflict and the climate. People are not leaving a place because of the climate. They are leaving a place more because of a situation of war or because of ongoing hostilities or military hostilities. However, the climate has a dramatic, the climate change or climate risk has a dramatic impact. Just to give you a few examples here, in Somalia in 2011, there were, in addition to the ongoing hostilities, 2 series of severe drought, which have prompted a number of displacement, to join also what Renata was saying, displacement of population, which has brought to 200,000 deaths, linked to both conflict and displacement due to the war. Another example is northern Mali, where we have here a mix of several different factors, like the degradation of the environment, democratic growth, climate risk, ongoing conflicts, lack of infrastructures, weak governance. So the people have had to adapt to all those changes, but changed their way of living, and while the hostilities were ongoing. So what we see that both the effect of a conflict and climate have prompted people to get displaced, have prompted infrastructures in the place where people are displaced, a lot of pressure. It means that today, let's say in a hospital where people have to go to receive treatment or to be treated, are already under pressure from an existing population. So my question here is more how to get, and we are talking about Rohingya situation, we are talking about several examples around the world, where the question is, how do we prepare for these people to return? While we know that the places of origin of these people have been under strain, have been affected by not only the war, but also the effect of the climate. So a shock, a double vulnerability here that prompts not only the infrastructures, but also human life to be at risk whenever they have to return.
Of course, I think you're right in saying that this is not only a humanitarian problem, it's also a political problem. And Iztok, Mirošič, you represent a country that finds itself right now on one of the migration routes, and I would like to ask you the question about the international tools and policies and processes that are in place, and are the current frameworks sufficient? And if not, What are the main problems from a humanitarian and a political point of view?
Thank you, and thank you for the question, and all of those who are with us in this panel. Basically, we are faced with migrations that are caused more, let's say, what my predecessors said, which are caused of a conflicts there. But we do not necessarily say that these conflicts are without basis in the climate change root cause out of it. But directly we are faced with a war predominantly in Libya, and many of migrants that come from sub-Saharan Africa to Libya and then through central Mediterranean route to Italy, which is now closed. And that's why a majority of migrants and refugees have turned to the Western Balkan routes, which means that they go from Libya or through Libya to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Turkey, Greece, and then through Balkan route through Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, to Slovenia, to Croatia, Slovenia, and then further to Germany and Austria. Of course, you are well aware that globally, but also inside the European Union, we have a quite deep division and lack of trust among countries how to tackle this problem. There is a division on a global level between countries that are source of origin of migrants and refugees, and those, of course, who are recipient country or final destination country. And inside the European Union, we have the same problem, how to tackle this migratory problem. There is a deep division, and we cannot hide it inside the European Union, how to regulate, let's say, asylum, European asylum system. There is a division between the countries of on the first line of migration, like Italy and Greece, and southern flank of the European Union, and those who are a final destination and who might or who are supposed to show solidarity and burden sharing, which we cannot agree how to tackle. Slovenia, of course, just in, let's say, a few months of 2019, we've got around 16,000 of migrants. But more problematic is that the concentration of migrants that are coming predominantly from Afghanistan and from Pakistan and Morocco and Algeria, I think, the concentration is in very, let's say, fragile Bosnia and Herzegovina. And here European Union would like to help, but on the same side, we would like, of course, to strengthen the outer border of European Union control. In Slovenia, based upon the experience from 2015, when the first wave of migration hit the European Union, and in 1 month Slovenia was crossed by 500,000 of refugees, of course we were faced with the closure of the so-called Schengen border. You know that inside the European Union exists so-called Schengen area, which is without internal borders. But let's say some countries, Germany, introduced the border control with Austria with Slovenia, and unfortunately we had to introduce the border controls and also a fence on the border with on our border with Croatia, because Slovenia is a Schengen, the last country for the Schengen border of the European Union, and Croatia is the country that controls the European Union outer border. So we are still aiming Slovenia and other countries that are faced with migrations, of course, to boost the debate in the frame of the European Union regarding the asylum system and regarding the European migration policy. But as far as you know, and as I mentioned from the start of this my debate, like we have disagreements on global level regarding the global migrant pact, more than a global refugee pact, we cannot agree how to tackle this problem in the European Union. Commission now is supposed to present a new revised asylum European policy until March this year. But I do expect the debate will be very, very, very tough. And as you know, as a consequence of unilateral solutions inside the European Union, which might influence the human rights of migrants as well, and not coordinated actions, we were faced in the European Union with the rise of populistic movements, which directly influenced, of course, the policies of countries and directly on the reception of the migrants in the European Union. I think that migration and more than refugee policy, migration policy of the European Union is probably one of the most outstanding questions right now in the European Union, because influences on almost all the policies of European Union and stances of the member countries. At the end of the day, we can say because of the closure of the Schengen borders, internal Schengen borders, it influences also the economic growth inside the European Union. So migration is connected to several policies, and that's why European Union would like to have a comprehensive approach to tackle the problem on a global level, but also with tailor-made programs with the countries of origin and early warning systems that should be established in the countries of origin, but in combination with the countries of transit and the countries of the final destination. And of course, we are preparing a so-called program, strategy plan for Africa to boost the developmental aid and investments to the countries of origin. But I think that this would not be sufficient to tackle the whole problem.
Thank you so much. It's a bit of a political Gordian knot. It reminds me of my favorite quote from Jean-Claude Juncker, who says, "We all know what needs to be done, we just don't know how to be elected after we have done it." Your response brings in our final panelists. Madina, you have been so patient. The question of finances, because this is in lieu of any great change in terms of international laws or a great willingness to take climate refugees in the rich countries. This seems to be the most viable option, some sort of financial assistance to countries that are hit most hard by climate changes and climate migration. And this is a little bit unfair, but could you perhaps touch upon the processes in the African Union, since we have been dealing with the European Union already?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm Madina from Uganda, but I'll try to touch on the issues around the African Union. Indeed, there is a clear policy within the African Union around migration and the guidelines around guiding the countries on tackling issues around migration. But again, the African Union has a separate, again, policy on climate change. But now looking at how these can speak to each other, in terms of coming down to financing issues around the country level is the issue now. And you find that for each country, because of the levels of development, financing is not going to be uniform. And because of the issues around the level of impact of issues related to climate change and exacerbating issues around migration, both related migration both from the natural causes and the migration from conflict. So you find that financing is not separating these two. And I'll give a case for, let me say, for Uganda right now. We are having two kinds of migration taking place. And through the Office of the Prime Minister, which is mandated to tackle these issues, we are bordering South Sudan, and Christine talked about that. We are the second topmost country in the world bringing refugees in the world, with the biggest camps of refugees. And these refugees are more from the political component of it than the natural component of it. And the financing which is coming in from the European Union is mostly tackling the conflict kind of migration and not the natural cause kind of financing. And you find now that our governments, despite the law being very clear in terms of supporting the internal migration, which is highly taking place between borders and across borders within the country, they are really lagging behind in terms of financing from governments to prioritize internal migration from the natural causes. So these are kind of things that are impromptu and not really well planned because the financing landscape is so minimal at country level. And this lack of prioritization, you find that it's something which is coming in. Where is financing coming from? The European Union is either fronting the refugees from Congo, but not looking at those who are highly affected by the natural causes, like we're having now the mudslides. We had too much rain, so the mudslides covered so many homes around that, and something which keeps coming up. But government is never ready in terms of financing these kind of disasters. We saw it in Mozambique when the cyclone happened. But again, until Christine they came in, but they did not come in to support the government per se. They came in to directly deal with the cyclone-related disasters. So you find that even the migrants or the people who are actually being affected by this kind of issues are not willing to migrate either because of the history attached to where they are. So the financing issues around it, also in terms of allocating homes, allocating them food, these are just some things which are not long-term.
Do you think that we will see a redirection of foreign aid towards these kind of situations, away from past priorities?
I think it's not going to happen in the short term, but probably in the long term if this continues escalating. But again, it has to come from the African governments to front this, that this is critical. Because on the other end, we see the kind of financing coming from the north is partly we look at it in terms of protectionism. How can we protect our colonies in the borders to limit this migration from this other side to this side? So we find that kind of financing is more on the conflict end than the natural end. And I don't see it happening for the natural causes within the short term, probably in the long term.
Is there anything resembling a consensus amongst African countries being crystallized in the European Union, in the African Union?
There is a bit of the negotiations are ongoing. That's what I think I deduced from that. The bit of negotiations towards how they can address a bit of both. But the issue is they're trying to lay emphasis that some of these issues, they need to see the African governments coming in by themselves to take this on hand in terms of prioritizing their issues downstream as a country than coming in from the other side. So the issue is more in strategic direction and guidance than finance.
It seems to me from all the responses here in the first round that we have an international system that has not responded to this kind of challenge in a very effective way. And I would like to pose to all members of the panel a simple question, which is of course an incredibly difficult one, and that is, what is needed and what is the most realistic efforts that we can choose to get ahead of this problem, or at least to address it more effectively? Kanchan, you're looking at me so intently, so I think you will answer first.
Yeah, so I think it is now clear that we need to look at, there is no one single migrant. So you may have climate migrants, you may have economic migrants, you may have political migrants. People who are migrating because of political persecution or religious persecution. You may have migrants who are migrating for a better future, and you may have migrants who are trying to escape the impact of climate. But along with that, you also have conflict. And like my esteemed fellow panelist explained, that this conflict often gets conflated with climate. Although I don't think there is much evidence to prove that the two are interlinked. Now, as far as funding is concerned, the point which I had made is that instead of trying to deal with the migration that is happening in terms of which country gets to take in how many and what do you do with them, the money which you spend on them, I think there is need for a concerted global effort to address the basic concerns that are arising from climate change in vulnerable countries, in underdeveloped countries, in developing countries. That would at least begin the process of a medium-term solution and also force local governments to look closely as to how to deliver better on governance issues. A second point which I wanted to make is that we also need to look at the political aspect. Now you have a situation where Turkey openly threatens that if you do not listen to me, I shall flood you with migrants. I mean, what kind of, we are talking of the human factor. I mean, this is the most inhuman you could get, where you try to use migrants as a weapon of conflict in itself. So these are issues that need to be discussed. These are issues that need to be resolved. And when such threats are made, I think the international community owes it to migrants to take a stand and say that no, this is not going to happen. You are not going to flood Europe with migrants. And on conflict too, the Syrian conflict, just as it was winding down, Turkey was allowed to move in and reignite the fires. So why aren't we addressing these questions? Why is it that in sub-Saharan Africa, we still have conflict which is manipulated from outside of Africa?
Good point, and fortunately, you pointed towards a world effort, and we do have a representative from the United Nations here, Renata. And am I right? Am I wrong in saying that the attempts at a global migration compact, it turned into a bit of a shit show for the United Nations? Pardon my English.
Maybe I can start by just responding to some of the interventions up until now, because I think that I would entirely agree that climate change is not maybe even the primary cause of migration, but it's certainly becoming a cause. And so in my opening remarks, I didn't want to imply that climate migrants, all migration obviously is not caused by climate change. And so therefore, there are multiple causes, and there has to be a multitude of hopefully coherent responses to the issue. But I think that we don't put enough attention on the word climate justice often refers to, who pays. But is it the historic emissions, those who produce the historic emissions that should pay, or those who are contributing to future emissions? But I think there's another dimension of climate justice, and it has to do with, those who are forced to move, and there are some that are forced to move solely because of climate change. Many times it's mixed up with conflict, it's mixed up with a whole range of things, but there are. In fact, from 2008 to today, there's an estimated 22 million climate migrants, pure climate migrants, who you could then argue whether was that severe weather, directly caused by climate change, or was it just a erratic, weather event or natural event? But the numbers are there, and I think we need to think about that from a justice perspective as well, because these people did nothing. Usually, they did nothing to actually provoke climate change. So getting back to your question, I think we're waking up late to this problem. I think that we have many other related, absolutely critically related processes going on. I mean, the whole, UNFCCC process is about climate, not anymore just mitigation, but also about adaptation. We have the Sendai Agreement, which is all about adaptation. India itself has just launched this coalition for disaster-resilient infrastructure, which is about both adaptation and mitigation. Prevention is always better than cure. We know what has to be done. We had the Nansen Initiative, which basically focused clearly and squarely on climate migrants. And it came up with a whole set of recommendations, which I think to their wisdom, or the wisdom of the member states involved, decided not to create a new instrument, but to try to fold these recommendations into existing instruments. The migration compact that you referred to is only one of many. I think the bottom line is really, is there enough political will? Is there enough political will to deal with it?
Yes or no?
I think that the facts speak for themselves. Clearly not. Clearly, there's a problem, and we're talking now about climate migrants. But if you look at the UNFCCC, there's a fundamental problem there. Member states are having trouble doing what they know that has to be done, and part of it has to do, I think, with the fact that we've gotten stuck in a kind of north-south perspective on the issues, when what we really need right now is the enlightened North and the enlightened South to come together and find some breakthroughs. It's not going to be easy, but it's not as if we don't know what has to be done. I mean, we know what has to be done. The problem is political will, and I think also the world is being stretched. We have so many big global challenges that are that nations have to look at, have to respond to. And I think that many of our instruments haven't really caught up with the reality of today. And therefore, I think it's important that we, I think there needs to be a rethink. I think there needs to be a rethink about how some of these problems are addressed. We put all the responsibility on governments. Private sector has a huge role to play. Some of the most innovative work to mitigate climate change is actually happening in the private sector. So I think we need new platforms. Civil society is also bringing some interesting ideas out. We need new ways of negotiating our future, our common future.
Christina, you are representing the organization, I'm very proud to say, that has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize more often than any other institution in the world, and it's not a government institution. And I would like to ask you, do you think that the Refugee Convention should be amended to include climate refugees? Should we go via the law when there is no political will to broach this topic? Do you think is that viable? Or what do you think should be done?
Thank you for the Nobel Prizes that we have received. Indeed, it has been a long history. Just an observation I'd like to make before answering to your question. Today, in the current world where we have two kinds of things, the protracted long-term conflicts that have been there, we talk about South Sudan, we talk about Somalia, we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about the Philippines, we talk about Myanmar, that you have years of conflict that have been affected the life of people. And suddenly you can have in those very countries and new countries acute crises or acute new conflict that are piling up in addition to that. Add to that the climate risk or changes, you have here a very, very difficult job for us to do, because we have already a lot of difficulties to absorb the very humanitarian needs that are linked to our mandate, to the conflicts. You add to that absorbing the consequences of the conflict of the climate, it will be very, very difficult in the coming years. So I'm just putting it as a very huge challenge. Because I believe that the limitation could be financial, could be human resources, in which we are working today. we have also limitations. We can't, it's not endless. Another remark I would like to make, and this is really a field observation, and it's very important I believe it's very important to bring it to your attention. We talk a lot about cross borders, we talk a lot about refugees, but you have in certain countries populations that cannot even afford crossing an international border, that are stuck within a country because of an extreme vulnerability. Conflict setting I'm talking about, but not only. So the convention, the refugee convention, maybe before answering it, and this is more for you, Renata, to answer, there is at least a need to reflect about that. But this might not solve all our entire problem, and the necessity to have global effort or consultations that Professor Gupta was saying, it's absolutely needed. But it doesn't mean that we would respond to all the needs, given the fact that a part and big parts of population cannot even cross borders. The third remark I'd like to make, for me, which we see as ICRC as extremely important in order to address some of those issues, are two major components: the peace and the security. How can we address conflict or climate change without even addressing peace and security? Today we are talking about protracted conflict where people cannot even think about returning back home, not even thinking about rebuilding, replanting, having their livestock back. There is nothing anymore. It has been destroyed and very often for many decades. So you don't find anything anymore back home. So this key element, peace and security, are absolutely key in order to be able to think about decreasing somehow the pressure on urban infrastructures, but also decreasing the pressure on the given population that has been sometimes for years displaced due to the reasons we have mentioned earlier.
And that, I think, sorry, Iztok, if you will allow, I just wanted to bring in Madina on this, because this dovetails very much with your initial comments. Could you care to elaborate a little bit more about what you see as the viable solutions to, if not solve, then at least alleviate some of the challenges that Uganda is a poster child of?
Thank you. I think one of the issues I think we have to agree is we need environmental migrants to be protected by law. That's for sure. And the law right now is not looking at them in terms of protecting them when some of these issues happen. And we need also to see issues around amending these refugee laws that at least we have even within countries, to go beyond these political conflicts, to look at issues that include migrants related to climate. And we see that at least we need to see clear relocation plans that are coming out of this. As she has correctly indicated, based on the fact that because of population pressure from these incapable or less economically viable populations, the population pressure, and we know climate is happening on land and on people. And the population pressure is leading to bad usage of this land, such that when we see issues around cyclones or floods happening, because of the bad management issues around land, due to population, due to issues around bad economic moves, then we see that happening. So we need the viable solutions towards how do we control the population in the land usage, clear, such that when some of these things happen, or mitigation measures are put in place, adaptation measures are put in place, like enforceable infrastructure, then it can really be sustainable or resilient to the changes in climate. But without looking at the population pressure on land, then migration, even forced migration to move away from the land that people have been sustaining their livelihoods for a long time, is going to be something which is going to be a bit difficult for a long time. But the legal mandate is required, and required yesterday. And the global leaders need to see this happening. And then we need to see the local governance structures also putting in place this mindset that without addressing the land issue, population and land pressure, then climate change aspects will continue being very hard-hitting and on the poor more. So we need to see this happening and exacerbating over time.
Thank you. Iztok, Mirošič, it seems that your co-panelists have kind of left you high and dry, because I asked 2 questions. One is what should happen, and then what is likely to happen. And I know that that you are a professional diplomat and, of course, very positive. But could you give us a cold-eyed assessment of what is likely to happen on this score in the short to medium term? Do you see any prospects for any of these initiatives being picked up multilaterally or even globally?
Well, thank you for you hear me, it's the right one or not? Or is that one? Which one is better? Thank you for calling me positive. From diplomacy is expected to be a realistic one, and probably I'm a realistic as well. Meaning, you know, I think I would agree with Mr. Gupta here that probably it would be more realistic to expect that the world would do something on root causes like climate changes than to change the definition of the refugees. If I'm very radical, you know, still the migrants, if are not going to countries in a regular mode, including the environmental migrants, they are considered as irregular migrants, and with all the consequences that are with that. And that's the problem on a global level. You know, in a present situation, when the countries are retreating from the multilateral mechanisms and organizations, and including the Paris Climate Accord, it's difficult to see that we will be able to put some consistent policy on a multilateral level. I would like to see it, like my predecessors said, but in a present climate, I'm very, very skeptical that we will manage to put or to change the definition of persecution in the Refugee Convention from 1951. There are some tries to put it into the Global Migrant Compact, but I think that this will still, for a considerable future, be based on a case-by-case cases and on humanitarian and solidarity approaches of the countries in the world. You know, with all respect, European Union now has a new European Commission with a new vision, and this is that Europe will be a carbon-free or carbon-neutral continent by 2050. I wonder whether the rest of the world will follow this example, and I doubt it very, very much. It will sooner or later become a question of competitiveness on a global scale, with all effects on the climate change that many of them said that they are not directly connected to the migration. But I think that scarcity of resources is a root causes of the conflicts, if not the conflicts of instability, be it regional, be it in particular countries, and this led to migration of people. So realistically speaking, I'm not very convinced that the international instruments will change to an extent that would cover also environmental migrations in a due course or a due time. Particularly because, as I said, multilateral system is obviously changing into a multipolar world where the power of certain players is more important than a collective action, including the protection of human rights. I would be very satisfied if I'm wrong regarding that one, but I'm afraid I'm not. And the other aspect is of environmental policies is whether this is a class question or not, with direct influence on the migration, including environmental migration. who will pay for all this, for all the tackling of the climate change? Obviously, it was used to be till nowadays that the middle class would pay for everything. This is not anymore the case. We are faced with in France, we are faced in some other countries, and obviously this question should not, but it is turning into a class question as well, not adding to the resolution of the migration problems that we are faced with. And I'm very honest. The most pressure problem right now regarding the migration is probably for the European Union, and other continents are not very, let's say, in a mood of response to that continental problem. At least we see in Europe like that.
I think you touch upon something that several of the speakers have broached it, but perhaps needs to be said. And as I understand it from colleagues in the NGO community, one of the reasons why there is a great reluctance, even amongst NGOs, to reopen the International Refugee Convention is a fear that any reopening of negotiations will result in a drastic limitation of the existing provisions for refugee status, because this is where the prevailing winds are blowing.
What I wanted to say is that policies of countries are more focused on protection of borders right now than probably to showing solidarity through the broadening of the convention on refugee status. And probably you're right. It might result in even narrower interpretation of or fixation of the international instruments, which probably nobody wants nowadays.
So, ladies and gentlemen, now you have eaten. It's time to sing for your food. I promised Samir Sahan that I would open the floor for questions, and we have you wonderful people. We have a lady running with the mic, I hope, or she might just be running out of the room. We will start with the gentleman at the back and then the gentleman at the front. And please say who you are and ask a question. Don't make a speech. And if you can direct the question to a panelist, that would be great too. So that's the gentleman at the back there. Can you please raise your hand again?
Thank you. My name is Nahim Razak. I'm a member of parliament from Bangladesh and also the convener for Climate Parliament. Of course, I do respect and take great care in terms of your inputs, the panelists, but I would like to differ in one of the aspects. Bangladesh, of course, has taken a huge amount of refugees in the amount of, let's say, in the numbers of 1.1 million. Now, when I say these refugees are not directly climate refugees, but then again, the adverse effect these resettled or these migrants have on the climate is adverse. In the region of 2,000 acres of land have been deforested in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is affected majorly in terms of climate. At the same time, the coastal areas, which protects us from cyclones and cedars, those trees had to be cut down. 2,000 acres of land accumulating to almost $220 million of damage. Now, when we talk about these things, these aspects also needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about migration and whether these refugees, whether in the form of climate refugees or in terms of displaced refugees because of extreme violence in the region, we need to talk about adaptation and how we can address these refugees and the adverse effect that these settlements happen. Thank you.
We need a question as well, right?
Yes, of course. Whether we can take up this refugee crisis as an adverse effect that they have in climate, I mean, in our own countries. Whether we can adopt that in COP26. That's also one of the proposals that we wanted to actually address.
Professor Gupta, I will give this one to you since you have already touched upon it.
Yes, actually, I was recently in Dhaka and I learned a lot more about the huge, and as I said, I am using the word burden after due consideration. I mean, that is the right word. I mean, Bangladesh is hugely burdened with more than 1 million Rohingya who have fled Myanmar. Now, the Bangladesh government has had several rounds of talks with the government of Myanmar. They agreed on staggered returns. Even that didn't work. And usually that is the trend with migration. I mean, even if you call it climate migration, although in this case it was not climate migration, migrants do not want to go back. So the point which Naeem made over here is important, that you have this huge influx of Rohingya. They are refusing to go back. You have to create space for them. They are cutting down mangrove trees to create that space. That causes its own ripple effect. The coastline already is endangered. That gets further endangered. So somebody needs to factor in these things too. Linked to that, I would just make one more point about who pays. I think he has a point that, you know, the middle class would say that why should I pay for it? But you either pay now to stop or at least mitigate the migration, or you pay later to deal with a flood of migration. So this is a choice the world has to make.
Thank you so much. And we had a, of course, yeah.
I would just said we are talking about mass influx, and mass influx are not covered by the international instruments, and that's why the danger is if you are reopen that even narrower interpretations, since the mass influx are causing tremendous problems in the asylum procedures, especially in the European countries. Of course, European Union would like to see regulation of migration on a global scale, but I'm not sure that here we have a consensus inside the EU already tackling the European approach how to tackle this migration. Again, maybe temporary protection mechanism would be a solution, temporary protection, because we are faced with a mass influxes which are not covered by the international conventions.
You're absolutely right, but you know, according to the estimates I've read, Europe takes some, what, 80% of all the asylum seekers in the world. So it's this is a distinctly European way of migration. But you and I, we can have that discussion later. We have another question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Patryk Kugiel. I'm a researcher at the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. We just started in my institute the research project for 2 years lasting, trying to understand the nexus between migration and development. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to consult the panel with one of the questions that we are trying to understand, the problems that we are trying to understand. Basically, following the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 in Europe, many European countries and politicians and European Commission also adopted an approach to migration, trying to tackle, to solve the problem by addressing root causes of migration, by solving the push factors that makes people leave the places. And the main tool that we have at our disposal to do this, to address the root causes, is to use development assistance, which is also controversial to many NGOs and other people. So my question is about your opinion, whether this is the right approach to use development assistance to solve the migration problem, to tackle this challenge. And one short question to Kanchan Gupta, since I'm going to Bangladesh also to Rohingya refugees next week, I would like to ask you if you can elaborate a bit. You said large influx of migrants, of refugees to Bangladesh is a huge burden. But my question is whether it is not also an opportunity in some way for Bangladesh, whether it cannot give also some advantages and benefits to Bangladesh, whether in economic or political way. In other way, I can link it to the larger problem, how we see the migration, whether this is a challenge or an opportunity, international migration, how we see it? Thank you.
I've heard of a Kinderegg of a question, but this was a whole Meccano set. Wonderful questions. Renata, would you care to do the first part, and then Kanchan, you can do the second? Will that work?
Sure. A very good question. I think that, as we mentioned before, there are multiple causes for migration. And if we're talking about, pure, if such a thing exists, pure climate migration, then what are the root causes? Are the root causes development, or are they perhaps other things? So I think, we have to analyze there'll be multiple root causes of migration, and we have to calibrate our response in conjunction with what those root causes are. Definitely, development is involved in most, or I put it this way, in some, and I would say even many cases of migration. But as I said before, if the international community doesn't come together around serious climate change mitigation successes and serious climate adaptation investments and new technologies to help in all that, development alone is not going to be adequate. The nice thing is that the international community has already a comprehensive framework. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals. And if every country implemented the Sustainable Development Goals perfectly, there would probably be a serious reduction in migration, including in climate migrants. So we have instruments, but development alone, while of course I'm a big promoter of development, will not be able to solve problems that go beyond the sphere of development.
Professor Gupta.
Yeah, you see, Bangladesh has a surplus workforce. Bangladesh is under tremendous pressure on land use. It doesn't have much land that can be used. It's already under cultivation, or it is already inhabited. And Bangladesh also faces a water crisis. So it has a resource crunch. It has a resource crunch on various fronts. And then to expect that Bangladesh should look after 1.1 million refugees or absorb them in the Bangladeshi economy, I mean, I think that is a proposal that won't fly. The point which, and Bangladesh also has certain security concerns. I mean, this is not the forum to go into those security concerns, but they are serious security concerns. Now, the point is that we are talking about the plight of the Rohingya, but nobody wants to put pressure on Myanmar that you have to take them back. They are your people. Myanmar does not face any climate crisis. It doesn't face any imminent threat of social collapse or conflict. So that is where the role of the rest of the world comes in. Just a minor point, if, with your permission, if I could make, this point whether climate migrants should be classified as climate refugees. Now, you can keep on creating categories of refugees, but that does not mitigate or that does not address the root problem. The problem which triggers this kind of migration. And there I would once again reiterate that it's much better to create capacities. It is much better to create or to nudge countries to move towards better governance, give them the wherewithal to mitigate climate concerns, climate fallout, and encourage them to retain their populations within their borders and not let those populations move out.
Thank you for that sober assessment. Now I would like to The gentleman in the blue shirt, the red tie, and the grey suit, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Sergei Afontsov. I'm the Deputy Director of the Primakov Institute in Russia. My question comes to Renata. I'm a little bit puzzled with your argument. You told us that the recipes to cope the climate migration disease are, at hand and can be implemented. But what about the diagnosis of this disease? If I'm not mistaken, your statistics on climate migration refers to each and every weather-related cause of migration. But come on, droughts and floods are known throughout the human history. We do know about floods in Bangladesh since the very first day of the existence of this country. We do know about the decades of a severe drought in Ethiopia, well before the notion of climate change was coined. Do you think we need the more precise statistics on the incremental role of the climate change? Because otherwise we will be using the new notion for the well-known problems and spend a lot of money on low-carbon economy, raising the resource cost for developing countries without any impact on the problem we are talking about.
Right about the statistics. They're not pure climate change statistics. They're climate and severe weather-related events. But I'm not sure what the underlining point you were trying to make was, because are you saying that we shouldn't differentiate climate migrants from other migrants, or we shouldn't be pursuing climate mitigation efforts because somehow they're not related down the road? So I'm sorry, but I'm not really, I'm not quite sure I understood what the question was.
Okay, my point is as follows. If your statistics refer to the weather-related causes for migration in general, so why should we address this particular challenge with the strategies to cope climate change? We are not sure that any substantial increment to the normal level of weather-related migration was added by the climate change before we can differentiate between the normal weather-related migration and the increment added to this normal level by the climate change. We should not address this phenomenon as a climate-related migration. It's just weather-related migration. And we should address this phenomenon with the same tools as we addressed them in 70s, in 80s, 20 years ago, without any reference to the climate change, prevention policies.
Yes.
So I think part of it relates to causality, and is it carbon emissions that are resulting in these various weather events, or to what extent it might be incrementally? That's a very scientific question, but I think the final result is perhaps similar, that whether an extreme weather event and repeated extreme and increasingly forceful weather events are the cause or not is perhaps less important than the result, which is that we're still seeing large numbers of people who, if you would like, clump extreme weather and perhaps to some extent influenced by climate change events, resulting in the same human toll and human suffering. So, I think I think that no one would, well, maybe somebody would take issue with the fact that more adaptation is needed, more climate resilient adaptation, more severe weather related events is needed, and that at least according to the the international panel on climate science is telling us that there is a relationship there, and it's likely producing what we're calling here climate migrants. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, whether it's weather, related or climate related, the question is, do they merit as kind of specific focus? And I would say, yes, they do merit a specific focus because they're not economic migrants and they're not political migrants. There may be situations where they're mixed, but they're not one or the other. They're not responsible for the weather, and therefore they need some special attention. And one of the questions, which was on the sort of description of this session, was the issue of definition. And your question, I think, gets to the heart of this. And I think my point would be, yes, there needs to be specificity.
I'm so sorry to the last two people who have asked, who wants to ask a question. I have been ordered from the sidelines here that we need to evacuate the room. So I'm going to bring this panel to a conclusion, but I would like to ask the two people who were waiting to ask a question to come up here and pose the question just bilaterally to the panelists. Will you please all join me in a big round of applause for the panel?